Hello and welcome. Um, Welcome to our first virtual program with the Whitney Museum of American Art. My name is Richard Morales, and I am the manager of community partnerships at the LGBT Community Center, where we host, or I'm responsible for a lot of the arts programming, so anything related to our exhibitions, our panels, our book presentations, and community-based conversations are things that I particularly work on. And I just want to take this moment to thank you all for joining us. Normally, we would be gathered at the center, which for almost 40 years has been the heart and home of the LGBTQ community, to gather and create space and to talk about any particular thing. This isn't our first crisis or pandemic, but during this crisis, the center quickly responded by moving a lot of their programs and services that were being provided in person to this new virtual space. So now 100% of all of our programs and services that were provided in person have resumed in these virtual spaces, such as the program that we're a part of right now, but also includes any mental health counseling, substance abuse recovery programming, services for adults and young people, HIV services, and support groups for LGBTQ immigrants and our TGNC community members. We've also taken this time to add a number of new programs that are available to the public, including bilingual groups in Spanish to help address the community's needs at this time. We've also launched a virtual help desk that is open during our normal operating hours, and there's also a live chat feature that can be used in case you or anybody you know is in need of any services or resources to get what they need right now. So while we continue to bring programming like tonight's event for you all, we also appreciate any kind of support that you can give us. And in the chat box, I'll put in a link that you can click at your leisure to help support this kind of work. So please visit gaycenter.org/respond2020 to stay connected and to help us continue doing this work by making a general contribution. We understand that things are a little bit difficult right now, so any amount is welcome and greatly appreciated. So without further ado, I would like to pass the mic on to Joshua Lubin-Levy, who is going to be walking through a couple of art-related programming that the Whitney has. So take it away, Joshua. Thank you all.
Great, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to just share my screen right away so that you have the chance to do whatever you need to just set it up for your viewing pleasure. And while you take a second to sort that out, and if you don't know, you can actually set the screen to have a split screen function to be side-by-side view, I believe Zoom calls it, so that my face isn't covering the slideshow. But I'm Josh Lubin-Levy. I've been a teaching fellow at the Whitney Museum for a few years now. The teaching fellowship is designed for art history PhD candidates. And my specialty is actually on queer art. I wrote a dissertation on the artist Jack Smith. So I'm really delighted to be talking about some ideas about queer belonging, thinking about spaces of belonging, communities of belonging, and doing so through works of art that are either in the Whitney's collection or have maybe appeared recently in exhibitions we've actually done at the Whitney Museum. I should say, actually, right before I go on, if you have questions, feel free to share them as we go along. The Q&A function is the best way to do that. I'll talk for a little bit over 30 minutes, and then I'll turn to the Q&As and see, and happy to answer any questions you have. But to begin our discussion, we might look at the work of someone like Marsden Hartley, whose painting here is called Painting Number 5, and it's from 1914. It's 39 by 32 inches, so it's fairly sizable as a work. And you can see it has a lot of texture to it. In fact, there's a lot of symbols and icons inside of that texture, much of which is drawn from military paraphernalia, flags, flags. You can see a checkered board down in the bottom right-hand corner. All of these things are elements of work Hartley was making while he was living in Berlin in the 19 teens. And while there, Hartley was very inspired by the sexual freedom he found in Berlin in those early years, the Weimar period. In fact, many found the kind of Berlin scene to be filled with a kind of sexual freedom that they didn't find elsewhere in the world. And yet what you can map this back onto is the idea that through these really textured lines that Hartley's creating, the attempt to render patterns, but to do so in a way where there's not a lot of perspectival depth. It's not like we see a flag in a field, but instead we see elements piled on top of each other. All of these are actually elements of not only an era of social or sexual freedom, but of aesthetic freedoms, as artists are practicing in new modes of painting along the lines of expressionism and cubism. This work has a very particular history to Hartley himself, which is that it was painted the year after his lover, Karl von Freiberg, had died at war. Karl von Freiberg was a young soldier who Hartley would often play chess with in his small one-room flat. And so that may be why we see a checkered board here. Unfortunately, Freiberg went off to war and died within a week of arriving on the front lines. And so this is really a memorial painting for Hartley to commemorate his partner, but of course he's doing so not by creating a portrait, but maybe by creating the emblems and the elements that he saw on Freiberg's uniform, a uniform that we might also imagine Hartley saw lying on the floor of his bedroom at times. And in that way, we might also think that this piling up of symbols and icons, almost like piled fabric, is a sort of reference to that essence of images and icons and materials as they've been kind of moved around in that space. All of this is to say that what Hartley's doing is cataloging a kind of queer relationship, but really doing it without pointing directly to his relationship with Freiberg. And that's partly a product of the age that he was living in. This is certainly a period where speaking so openly about his queerness would have been quite difficult. So he's rendering that kind of longing and loss in terms of coded symbols and icons. But maybe he's also asking us to think about different levels of belonging and different ways we relate to these structures. For on the one hand, these are elements that are so deeply connected to his lover, to the uniform that Freiberg would have worn, and yet they're elements of the military and by extension of the nation. And the idea of nationalism might have been something that Hartley was very kind of disaffected by as an outsider. So all of these things to say that this is one way we can see artists, even in the 19 teens, in a work that's in the Whitney's collection, thinking about queerness and how that might be portrayed. On another side of this, we could think about actually the spaces where queerness really thrived during this kind of early period of the 20th century. And a great work for that is a work by Florine Stettheimer called Studio Party Soiree from 1917. It is not a work that's in the Whitney's collection, although we do have some of Stettheimer's other paintings in collections. In fact, Stettheimer's work is not widely collected, partly because she kept very tight control over her works throughout her entire life, only wanting to share them with friends, not wanting to exhibit them or sell them. And in fact, when she died, in her will, she stipulated that one idea she had was to have all of her works be burned upon her death. Studio Party Soiree shows a scene that's actually very familiar to Stettheimer, which were her studio parties or parties she would host at her home on the Upper East Side with her sisters. These were parties where luminaries of the art world like Marcel Duchamp would go, but there are also parties that were very private, closed events where all sorts of relationships took place that couldn't necessarily be presented in public. One of the things you'll notice about Studio Party Soiree is that there's all these different couplings happening throughout the painting. Two figures down in the bottom left corner staring at a work, two figures sitting on a rug in the center of the painting, two figures in the upper left sitting on chairs and an ottoman right next to each other. And all of these appear to be same-sex couplings. So there's a sense that there is this element of queerness circulating in this realm. One of the most interesting aspects about this painting is that it's a studio party, meaning it's a party occurring, a private party happening in Stettheimer's studio. And on the back wall of the studio, you can see there's this sort of odalisque painting, this nude woman. That's actually Stettheimer herself. It's a self-portrait that she did. This is the actual self-portrait. It's called Nude Self-Portrait. It's from 1915. And it's on record as being the first painting of a nude female self-portrait by the artist herself. I don't know if that's exactly true. I haven't looked into the facts of it, but I do think it's an interesting moment to mark that, of course, the tradition of the female nude is a long tradition in art history, and it's often been signified or kind of an element of a kind of way in which gender gets constructed around the idea of who are the objects being viewed versus who is doing the viewing or doing the looking and even the making of that image. It's traditionally been male artists painting naked female figures. In this case, it's Stettheimer painting herself. So she's both the object and the subject of the painting. She's both the thing to be looked at and the one doing the looking. And there's an incredible amount of agency and kind of play and the idea that rather than simply becoming a painter and turning the gaze away from her, she turns it back onto herself on her own terms that we could talk about as a form of self-determination and self-creation even. So it's interesting to think that that's the image that's hanging over this whole scene of Florine Stettheimer's studio party soiree, maybe marking the idea that it's in her studio that she wants others to feel that same sort of agency, to look at and create themselves. Of course, there's an incredible kind of erotic dimension as well to painting her nude portrait, hanging it in her studio, and then inviting all of her friends over. Florine Stettheimer's sense of self-creation is something we'll see happen a lot in the realm of photography. And I give you here a work by Carl van Vechten. It's a scene from a well-known opera called Four Saints and Three Acts. The music was composed by Virgil Thomson. The librettos were written by Gertrude Stein, of course, and the set design was actually done by Florine Stettheimer herself. It was this radical set design where everything was made out of cellophane, so this very futuristic look. Carl van Vechten is a really fascinating photographer who took photographs of, oh, excuse me, my phone's ringing, photographs of operas and also ballets, but he did many of these photographs in his private studio in his own apartment, a studio space where he could create these imaginary worlds where people would pose nude. He did a lot of homoerotic imagery. So there's this sense that the studio space actually was an incredibly important space for creating communities of queer belonging. Interestingly, with this sort of studio space, we can see this continue into the work of someone like George Platt Lynes. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Platt Lynes' works. This is also a work in reference to Four Saints in Three Acts. It's a scene of several of the dancers. Platt Lynes, like Van Vechten, would take photographs of theater shows, documenting them in his studio. Although what Platt Lynes did quite distinct from Van Vechten was he often brought performers into the studio and invited them to create compositions that really spoke to something totally divorced from the narrative of the actual performance they were involved in. Here you see three young dancers, shirtless, laying on top of each other, holding one another. These become incredibly intimate, erotic, material encounters between bodies as they share space together. It's also kind of interesting to think about Platt Lynes' use of these images because he's taking these photographs at a time, and certainly not with this image, but with some of his nude photographs, his work could have been considered pornographic. And so he didn't often print these works, at least not for public display. Instead, he would sometimes print them and sometimes simply share his negatives only within a closed circle of friends, whether they were models who posed for him or other photographers. So the work of art actually became a way of creating queer community by sending and receiving images and sharing works that you imagine only other people could, that in your community could actually appreciate in the proper way. Now, the use of photography to kind of stage these relationships between bodies takes a really kind of interesting turn with the work of Pajama. And this is a work back to the Whitney's collection that has been on display recently. It's a work called Margaret French, George Tooker, and Jared French, Nantucket, 1946. And Pajama was actually a photography collective founded by 3 artists, Paul Cadmus, Jared French, and Margaret French. And the word pajama is actually the first 2 letters of each of their first names, Paul, Jared, and Margaret. Pajama was started around a time when Jared and Margaret French were married, and Paul and Jared were actually lovers. And what they would do is when they would vacation together in Fire Island or Cape Cod, or in this case, Nantucket, they would often go out in the afternoon, what they thought was the best time for light, and take photographs that stage relationships between their bodies, one another, the architecture that they found. They would dress up in costumes, and then they would print these images very small, and they would pass them out at parties. So again, using the work of art to kind of create a relationship or a network between individuals. By the time we see this image from 1946, Margaret French, George Tooker, and Jared French, George Tooker has entered the realm as one of Jared French's lovers. Paul Cadmus has gone off and found someone else, but they all continued to vacation together. And Pajama's images are really legion. They're these incredibly elaborate photographs. It's not only a few, it's hundreds and hundreds of images. You can actually access much of their archive on the Smithsonian's website if you're interested in looking at more. But this is actually how they would produce the images as a collective. They would take a bunch of photographs. In this case, we're looking at a photograph of a naked, unidentified figure. I believe that might be Jared French, but it doesn't say so actually in the record. They've discovered this driftwood that they planted into the earth. They brought the cord or the line with them, and then you see this naked figure experimenting with making different shapes with his body in relationship to the objects that surround him. So there's really a formal play around the use of the body, trying to see what different compositions one can create. And then they would print all these images out, and they would select which ones they were interested in. But they would also distribute these small images, as I said, as gifts. Now, of course, Paul Cadmus is sort of highly regarded in terms of the history of queer art, although that shouldn't get us to overlook the fact that Cadmus was very much disregarded during the time in which he made many of his works. Paul Cadmus had been painting these incredibly homoerotic scenes from the 1930s. A work that's in the Whitney's collection is Finisterre from 1952, so a little bit later. And Finisterre shows you this scene of cruising in a part of France, the westernmost point, that's called Finisterre, meaning the end of the earth. And it's a very traditional coastal town where there's this a very traditional form of dress that you can see represented by the men and the almost nun-like figure. She's not actually a nun, up in the right-hand corner. But of course, down below, you see the vacationers who've arrived in town to this coastal area. 2 men standing with their bikes, both wearing Speedos. One has the bike protruding right into his ass there. And of course, they're looking in the same direction, but they're also kind of glancing towards one another. And so Finisterre becomes this site of cruising. What's really interesting about this work is that Cadmus is making this in 1952. From the periods of the 19-teens where Marsden Hartley is working and Florian Stettheimer, even into the 30s, there's a sort of liberal quality to what one can get away with in terms of displaying queer relationships in art. By the 1950s, there's a huge backlash against that, owing to the Cold War and the kind of homophobic landscape of culture and politics. So what Paul Cadmus has to do is create a way to stage these scenes of desire, but in such a manner that it becomes almost more about masculinity or it could be read as more about masculinity. So you'll notice that the male figures here have more muscles than most human bodies are supposed to have. And also that they're deliberately not looking at one another, but that we have to read into where their gaze might be. So it's really a question of inviting the viewers who would find in this work the kind of representation of desire they might be looking for in art. A similar thing occurs in The Bath from 1951. This is probably my favorite of the Cadmus works we have in the collection. It's two men naked, sharing a bathroom together. Again, their bodies are painted in a way that echoes, very deliberately echoes, kind of a Greek god-like sculpture. And that's meant to be sort of unrealistic. It's meant to play against the censors who would call this a scene of homoeroticism, so that Cadmus could say, actually, this is a study of the male nude. And of course, here you have two nude male figures who aren't studying each other, but they're studying themselves. You have one man who's staring in the mirror, combing his hair, and another who's washing himself, looking down into the bath water, almost like Narcissus at his little pool of water, staring at his own reflection. They're surrounded by what appears to be business attire. So you could certainly read this as a scene of roommates getting ready for work, dressing in that very standard, typical dress of the 1950s, that conformist look. But in this particular moment, they have this encounter of intimacy where they're kind of vulnerably about to create that kind of public image that they'll take out into the world, and yet are sharing a naked space together. So if we go back to the idea of pajama, Cadmus, and what's going on here, what I'm trying to highlight is that moving into the 50s, you have this sense of creating or representing queerness by really thinking carefully about what the body looks like that's being represented and how they're arranged, how they're posed in relationship to one another. There's something very charged about the staircase here, the figure off in the distance, that it's trying to document this triangulated relationship, but it's also a kind of mode of making that's allowable under the kind of cultural censors that existed at the time. And that certainly carries into the 1960s with artists like Fairfield Porter, who will think very concretely about, importantly, about what it means to document one's community. Fairfield Porter is a portrait artist, but he's a portrait artist primarily during a period when abstract expressionism and abstract painting and minimalism were in vogue. So many critics dismissed his work as sort of sentimental, but Porter said it was important to paint the people in his life because that was what the art world was to him. His portraits are quite lyrical, like the portrait, The Screen Porch, which shows you a series of two young girls, both actually Porter's daughters, sitting next or standing next to the poet, James Schuler, who's sitting in a chair right there. And just outside the screen porch is Porter's wife, who's walking up from the edge of the painting. Now, you would have to be in the know to know this, but Porter and Schuler were actually lovers at the time, which adds a certain emotional tenor to the fact that his wife is standing outside of the screen porch looking in. And we could think about this in two ways. One, that it's not only a portrait of the people who are closest to Porter in his life, but it's a way of kind of bringing to light through the arrangement of these bodies his sense of proximity to these two figures he counted as partners. One, his wife, the other, the poet James Schuler. Maybe even a way of starting to kind of box his wife out of the image, as horrible as that might sound, as he tries to picture the family that he really desired to be with, this partner he had found and his two young daughters. Porter's paintings were not only kind of these subtle moments of capturing queer community, they were also quite famously portraits of some of the most famous artists from the late 1950s into the early 1960s. Fairfield Porter was very much immersed in the who's who of the art world. And so it's not surprising then to see that he also painted a figure who would become a seminal figure for queer art going forward, Andy Warhol. Here you have an image painting called Portrait of Ted Carey and Andy Warhol. And seated in the chair is Ted Carey, and standing next to him is Andy Warhol. Ted Carey was an artist as well as Andy Warhol. He was also working at the time as Warhol's studio assistant because Warhol was working primarily as an advertiser. And they were also boyfriends at the time. That I know that doesn't look like Andy Warhol in the background. This is prior to all of his makeup and wigs and plastic surgery. But it actually is Andy Warhol. I can prove it to you. Here's the image it's based on. Andy Warhol standing in the background, Ted Carey in the chair, seated this time with a marionette doll that Warhol, or a doll, excuse me, a wooden doll that Warhol bought at a flea market. He was an avid collector of these kinds of antique dolls and American folk art. But of course, what it also stages for us, both in the painting that Porter gives us and in the photograph I'm showing you on the right, is that it's a scene that poses itself as almost an echo of a kind of Victorian family photograph. It has this element of domesticity where you have one individual sitting in the chair and the other standing right behind them. The photograph even adds a kind of childlike figure to that scene. And that might be one of the things that Porter was doing in the way he composed these images, was to speak to the kind of chosen family, or even the longing for the recognition of this family, and doing so by framing queer relationships in very familiar ways or very familiar forms in which families had been previously photographed and posed. The interesting thing about Porter's work here is that Andy Warhol was not part of the who's who of the art world in 1960. He was very much outside of the fray of critically acclaimed artists, but Warhol was very successful as an advertiser. He'd made a lot of money, and he commissioned Fairfield Porter to paint this portrait. So he actually paid Porter to create a portrait that he knew would insinuate himself into the echelons of the art world. And in fact, Warhol would really rise to prominence in 1963, 64, particularly around his silk screens, beginning with his Campbell soup cans and going on to Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor and all of those icons we could imagine as sort of queer icons of the era. Warhol's queerer art comes about when he starts to make films in 1963, beginning with Sleep, which is, I have given you a still that's up in the left corner. Sleep is a 6-hour film, continuous shot of the poet John Giorno, the artist John Giorno, sleeping in Andy Warhol's bed naked. They were partners at the time. And it's this long, long study of a figure sleeping. It is an incredibly beautiful and incredibly boring film. And it's this extended, elaborate document of their intimacy. It's so excessive and kind of gilded in a way to imagine that what Warhol did was set up a camera and just film his lover sleeping for 6 hours straight. And yet it challenges the idea of what counts as queer art in this era, because the sleeping figure is such an old trope in art history that Warhol again could point back to that logic when he shared this work with a wider audience. Warhol's works, especially his films, would go on to be slightly more in dialogue with desire and sex. Films like Couch from 1964 are really interesting works where you see a couch, a very famous couch, one that was prominently used in the factory, which is what Warhol called his studio at the time. And in this 54-minute film, there's multiple different couplings between a variety of different individuals who all engage in various pornographic acts, various forms of sex taking place on the couch between Gerard Malenga, who you see lying on the top of the couch here, and other figures such as Peter Orlovsky, Jack Kerouac, Taylor Mead, Ivy Nicholson, Amy Taubin. So there's this whole kind of rotating array of what sex looks like all around this couch. Harlow is my favorite of the Warhol films. If you do get a chance to see it, it's the first one that's synced with sound. And it features the drag superstar Mario Montez performing as Jean Harlow in a series of vignettes written by the artist Ronald Tavel. And all of this at a time when the idea of the glamorous Hollywood starlet was such a way of thinking about a kind of a drag act, a mode of queer identification with forms of cinema and media like mass entertainment at Hollywood that really didn't have a lot of space for queer representation in this moment. Warhol's films would become scandalously homosexual beginning in the 1960s, but his work had always had this idea of documenting queer belonging and queer communities. Warhol has been known as a collector of people. The factory became a hub for queers and outsiders to gather and hang out, and even became very cool to be part of that in crowd. But back in the 1950s, when Warhol was making these ink blot drawings of kissing, two boys kissing, he was being laughed out of galleries when he tried to share his work, and had a lot of trouble finding a way to actually create work around this theme that would also be shareable with a wider audience. And it's interesting to think about Warhol's kissing scene here, which is a scene essentially of two boys kissing in relation to someone like David Wojnarowicz, who would find a different way to mobilize that image of two boys kissing, which we can see at the center of his painting here, fuck you, faggot, fucker. Fuck you, faggot, fucker, which is a really aggressive title, is not necessarily a title created by the artist, but it's rather a found title. You can see just below the print of two boys kissing, there's this fragment of brown paper. On that, there's a cartoon of two people having sex, and it says, fuck you, faggot, fucker, on that piece of paper. And it was a found note that Wojnarowicz found on the ground while walking through the East Village, which is where he lived at the time. And he took that as the premise for this work, actually layering that onto a map of the world, putting this image of two boys kissing, which appears regularly throughout Wojnarowicz's paintings. It almost becomes like his signature, his sign or something, his signature, or a way of identifying his works. And then what he did was to wipe out actually the territories of the world, the way in which the world had been mapped and laid down and has often been accepted as a kind of a scientific code, and covering those over with 4 separate photographs. And the 4 photographs are all from Wojnarowicz's own life. 2 of them are David Wojnarowicz and his friend from high school, John Hall, appearing naked in the Christodora settlements in the Lower East Side. And the Christodora settlements were settlements that had been abandoned by the period that Wojnarowicz was frequenting them. And they'd become like a really important site for queer cruising, public sex. It was also a space in which many people without homes were able to seek shelter. And so that's one of the worlds that he's mapping through these photographs, indexing his own kind of mapping of the world. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, what you have is a photograph of the artist and poet Brian Butterick, dressed up as Saint Sebastian, photographed in the West Side Piers. And I'll talk about the piers in a few slides from now. But to think about Warhol's work as, or through like Wojnarowicz is thinking about that symbol of two boys kissing. Andy Warhol is kind of starts with that, but never really fully realizes it in the way that Wojnarowicz does. Similarly, Warhol is sharing all these images of female celebrities as these kind of queer icons, but he never really arrives at the complexity of thinking about the realm of identification with one's celebrity icons, and also the desire in the same way that Glenn Ligon does. This is a self-portrait at 11 years old by Glenn Ligon from 2004. And it's essentially a portrait by the artist of himself at 11 years old. Although, of course, the image is not Glenn Ligon at 11 years old. In fact, the image is of Stevie Wonder from the album cover of his 1977 album, Looking Back. And so what Ligon, who was a child, just a child when this album came out, is doing is maybe thinking about how Stevie Wonder, as this attractive black male figure, presented both a kind of fantasy of someone like Glenn Ligon as a young boy could become, but also a figure of someone Glenn Ligon as a young queer boy may have desired. And so that realm between being and having, or identifying with and desiring, becomes something that is introduced into the work. one of the things that's hardest to convey in a slide about this work by Glenn Ligon is that the image looks like a screen print. It looks very much like the kind of images that Warhol made. In fact, it's not a screen print, it's a paper collage. Ligon made these works at the Dieudonné, which is a well-known paper making facility in New York City, a studio in New York City. And the way he made this was to create essentially what's a kind of stencil, a Mylar stencil of the images of Stevie Wonder exactly as it appears on the cover album with those Ben-Day dots of printing. And then to push wet paper through that Mylar stencil onto this light blue page below it, and then to dye that paper. So when you get up close to this, what you see is that it's not ink on paper making the image, but it's paper on paper. There's something about like a fleshiness to the work and almost a sculptural quality that even makes it more intimate, more personal, the way this is made. It's so handmade, and yet it looks so manufactured. Or like mass manufactured. At that kind of boundary between thinking about desire and identification, Catherine Opie's work, Being and Having, is maybe a great turning point to looking at artists working around queer communities beginning in the 1990s. This is Opie's probably her first most celebrated work. Being and Having is a suite of 13 photographs of friends of Opie's, queer women in her kind of friend circle, all sporting different degrees of facial hair. And so the idea of representing a kind of butchness became such a central element of the way in which gender is being performatively displayed in these works, and then cataloged as a series of images that's displayed almost like a typology in the museum space. Opie will go on to make a series of portraits that are thinking about how do you allow portraiture to call to specific communities, and particularly to queer and trans communities. Opie's work, Dyke, from 1992, is a great example of that, where rather than simply subjecting the figure to being put on display, she instead has this individual turn away from the camera. So there's a denial of the idea to be captured or fixed or identified in any way. We can see that this figure's head is shaved, that they have earrings, but we don't see any of the necessary markings that one would see in all sorts of art that tends to gender the body. There's a sort of ambiguity around this figure, except for the tattoo that goes along the back or the ape of their neck, which says Dyke, which of course is a slur that is here being taken on as a symbol of pride and power and a way of calling to attention one's community. One of the great things about what Opie's doing here is not only making work to represent the queer community, and particularly the Dyke community in this case, but she's doing that through a language of art history to think about how these figures might relate back to all sorts of figures that have historically been chosen or elected into forms of portraiture. Opie's works call to mind the work of Dutch painter Hans Holbein from the 1700s with his very ornate, colorful backgrounds, all of which are essentially paintings of elaborate fabric that's meant to look like it was painted. So it has this incredible layer of mediation inside of it. Opie has done her own self-portraits in this regard. In particular, her self-portrait Cutting from 1993 is a really interesting work that calls attention to not only the kind of utopian aspect of how art might call its community into being, but also the tension that queerness faces in relationship to other forms of more normatively identified communities. This is a work in which we see the artist, Cathy Opie, turned away from the camera, and she's had someone carve into her back with a razor blade the image of a home and two figures holding hands and a sky, this like really very conventional scene of domestic bliss. And there's a couple ways to look at that, of course. One is to think about the violence that many queer and trans people experience in the nuclear heterosexual home growing up, the tension one feels against that model, which so many take as a kind of given. But in Opie's case, she's also talked about how it was a desire for this model, a desire to be married, to have kids, and feeling, especially at this kind of peak of queer politics in the 90s, that there was something difficult about acknowledging that desire for something that felt so normative, but that was really coming from her own wish for her own life and herself. And Opie, of course, has gone on to be married and have kids, and continue to make radical queer protest art. And one can have all of those things. But I like to think that this work is a way of that actually shows us the photograph holding these two narratives in play in a much better way than any kind of manifesto or statement actually could. Now, I've been talking a lot about artists who've looked at kind of portraiting or capturing individuals and even like the people who become part of one's community, become a kind of collection of belonging. But we could also think about the spaces of belonging. And here I just highlight again something like Warhol's Factory, which was really an insiders crowd made up of outsiders. And even the bathroom at Warhol's Factory would note this. These are the two bathrooms at the Silver Factory, and you can see all this graffiti that was done inside of the bathroom by someone named, that nicknamed Binghamton Birdie. And it's all these homoerotic drawings. We could certainly speculate about what might have happened inside of the bathrooms at Warhol's parties, particularly given the era and all sorts of things like that. But his bathroom reminded me, of course, of the bathroom at the center, which is Keith Haring's Once Upon a Time from 1989, which has an interesting play against something like this scene of the 1960s and the rise of sexual liberation, because Haring's making this work, of course, during the AIDS crisis. And he's making this work as a way of marking, I would say, the bathroom as a scene of queer cruising and public sex, and in that way, a site of community. Bathrooms and tea rooms and all sorts of spaces being one mode in which queerness established itself outside of the strictures of public space and the nuclear home. But he's doing this in a period where that is no longer really the case. The city having shut down so many of the bathhouses, policing these sites out of existence, rather than acknowledging the incredible space of community that existed around queer clubs and bars and sex clubs and even bathrooms, and that might have been a site in which one could distribute information about safe sex, about activism. Haring's mural, of course, is just filled with scenes of being penetrated and penetrating, phallic objects, orifices. So it really is a once upon a time in terms of like the longing for a kind of sexual freedom and a kind of erotic relation that he was mourning in this period of the AIDS crisis, and very close, in fact, to Haring's death. One of the things I always like to highlight about the mural is that though there are a lot of penises in Haring's works, there's also this cartoonish aspect to his works that extend the penis from things like the foot or into these creatures. So it's never so clear that this is just an explicitly male sexual dominated image. There's something cartoonish about the idea of these penises becoming prostheses, almost like dildos, having a life outside of the biological body, which is really interesting. And of course, the great thing about Haring's work is that that playfulness was part of what he was making in a series of paintings that were really derived from graffiti, the attempt to kind of make your own mark in the world. Haring doing this painting on the bathroom was not at all unusual. He would paint on anything. He would draw his radiant baby figures on anything, skateboards, shoes in a store, really going against the idea of the precious object of art. His goal, as he talked about, was to draw all over the world with these images and symbols that he saw as actually shaping the world that he wanted to be in. We could think about Herring's kind of engagement with the bathroom and this sort of sense of mourning for a lost queer public or queer community or queer sites of sex and desire. And certainly one of those spaces would be the West Side Piers, which were for many years these dilapidated structures where nude sunbathing, cruising, people without homes could make shelter, and were vastly documented by the artist Alvin Baltrop between the years of 1976 or 1977 and 1986. Alvin Baltrop was a photographer who had actually started out as a war photographer during the Vietnam War. He'd been a young queer kid going to the Stonewall Inn in the 1960s before going off to do that. And he discovered the West Side Piers and the kinds of makeshift communities that were being formed there in 1970 in New York. And he made it a whole art project out of simply documenting these spaces. The photographs are incredibly intimate. They're actually all quite small. And yet they move between different scales of seeing the body close up and stepping back and looking at the architectural dilapidation. This is one of my favorite works. It's called The Piers, Collapsed Architecture Couple Butt Fucking, and just love that that's part of the collapsed architecture and the couple butt fucking are actually paralleled with one another, because that's sort of what Baltrop's work is all about. Scenes of dilapidation, destruction, decay, and all of this happening because, of course, the city is not paying attention to what's going on in the piers. And yet what becomes possible at the piers is almost like this queer utopia, this horizon of possibility where outside of the policing of public life, other worlds can take shape. Baltrop also did a series of photographs documenting people who were living at the piers at the time, one of them being Marsha P. Johnson, of course, one of the founders of STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, and a central figure in trans history. And so there's a sense in Baltrop's work also that he's documenting a world that otherwise many people would have overlooked and continued to disregard or erase. So people are still continuing to return to Baltrop's photographs and discovering history that is really a central part of queer history, but for a long time had gone overlooked. And maybe just to bring us towards a conclusion, I'm going to skip over Martin Wong here. And share with you just two more works that felt sort of relevant for thinking about how we make community under these strange conditions we live in today. One of them is this work by Felix Gonzalez Torres, which is untitled, from 1989. This was a work originally commissioned as a billboard by the Public Art Fund, and it was commissioned to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion from 1969. And what was asked of Gonzalez Torres was to make a mural that was a commemoration of queer liberation and queer history. And what he made instead was this all-black mural with statements of dates and events that he saw as relevant to queer politics and queer liberation. What's interesting about this statement, which reads, People with AIDS Coalition 1985, Police Harassment 1969, Oscar Wilde 1981, Supreme Court 1986, Harvey Milk 1977, March on Washington 1987, Stonewall Rebellion 1969, is that it doesn't follow a linear model or a linear logic. And so he's resisting two things. One, he's resisting the demand to sort of create a monumental image of history, something that would heroize that moment as the culminating moment in a kind of queer politics, and instead favors this blacked out image that leaves a lot of room for us to speculate or project or imagine what could be on this billboard that is speaking to the 20th anniversary. Now we've lived through the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion, but he's also doing it in a non-linear fashion, thinking that this is actually how politics functions, not by going from one step to the next, but moving 2 steps forward and 4 steps backwards, thinking about the impact of AIDS onto a moment in which Oscar Wilde will be put on trial for his quote unquote profane relationship to Alfred Douglas. And so there's an interesting way in which this is actually about creating our own monuments, thinking about the relationships between these historical moments and projecting our fantasies onto them. And that's in fact what González Torres invited people to do later with these works, is he said, you can all make these untitled pieces. You just have to come up with what events and dates are relevant to you. He also described the idea that history can be written by discovering various tensions or aspects in the archives that we find all around us. One of the examples that I love of this is a work called Untitled Letters from the Warfront, which actually has a letter between two lovers, unidentified lovers, that has been cropped in such a way that we can't actually read the whole text. So there's something that's been kept private here. There's such provocative phrases inside of this work made in 1988. R.I.P. goodbye, having this deathly quality. Wish for bunny dreams and you. A virus in my prick, a perfect species host, destruction or is our love, and then indiscreet exposures, a Quebec air steward. So of course, all these references are speaking to the media's reporting around AIDS and the speculations about a patient zero and many things that have been problematized and critiqued by queer historians since then. But by cropping it out of the actual context of the fully written sentence, we start to imagine what this exchange is actually about. And what it comes down to for me is that there's an attempt for connection, a kind of longing relationship in the missives that are written here about love and desire, but also a fear of connection, about the destructiveness of love, of the virus in my prick, as he writes, or the fear of exposure, and that fear of one another being such an aspect of the AIDS crisis that really put an incredible amount of pressure on the ideas of queer community and belonging. And then that what González Torres does is to put this all on as an image onto a puzzle that hangs in the plastic bag it arrives in after being made by the manufacturer, so that it and then the way he would display it is actually tacking it to the wall. So it really had this quality that the puzzle, all these pieces that were so precariously held together, could fall apart at any moment. And something of that, of course, simply resonated with me for what's going on today. But if González Torres's works have a kind of somber note, I'll end with a little bit more of an upbeat moment from Jeffrey Gibson in a work that's in the Whitney's collection called I Know You Have a Lot of Strength Left. Jeffrey Gibson is an artist who identifies as Choctaw and Cherokee, but having sort of grown up inside and outside of these communities, really makes works that are drawing on Cherokee and Choctaw heritage and culture, but also thinking about a kind of hybrid space with queer politics and a fusion of materials and rituals that might be mobilized to support different queer and trans communities today. In this case, I Know You Have a Lot of Strength Left is, at first it kind of looks like a painting, but it's actually a very elaborately beaded rawhide. And it has printed on it this pattern that looks, and I'm speaking here about the blue and green pattern, that looks a lot like a kind of industrially manufactured print, a very mod kind of minimalist pattern. So he's got all these different layers playing against one another. And then in the center is a statement, I know you have a lot of strength left, which of course seems to be on one hand like a great protest poster, the idea that there's always more strength to be found. But of course, I'm sure as many of you know, is also a lyric from the inimitable Kate Bush's song, This Woman's Work. So there's a way in which Gibson is fusing popular culture, art history, Cherokee and Choctaw heritage, all combined into this image that's both playful, it's a kind of drag act, and it's also a sign of protest. And all of these different elements then being things that different communities might find immediately grabbing them when they're looking at the work, and then leading them to find intersections with other layers of the piece that Gibson's given us here. So with that, I'll stop talking. I'll take a look at the chat to see if there's any questions. But if you want to ask, feel free to put things in the Q&A. The studio painting seems similar to a Matisse painting. Yes, absolutely. Oops, let me just go back to here. Florine Stettheimer's soiree piece is very similar to Matisse's paintings. In fact, it's very similar to one of Matisse's most famous paintings, which is called Red Studio, where he paints his studio almost all in red. And it was a scandalous painting that he made in the 19-teens, in the same period, precisely because what he did was to paint the studio walls red and the tables red and the lamps red. And it was so many red objects that when critics looked at it, they couldn't tell what were his works of art that were in his studio and what was the walls in the background. And so people were really disturbed by the idea that what Matisse had done was paint red over everything so that he could decide what you should look at. Because of course your eye goes to the things that are not red in that room. I mean, that's definitely maybe a reference here, although they're painting very close to one another. Interestingly, with Stettheimer, I'll just say, if for those of you who are lovers of art history, of Marcel Duchamp will go on in his long Dadaist career to create a drag persona named Rose C'est la Vie, spelled R-R-O-S-E S-E-L-A-V-Y. And when you pronounce that with a French accent, and in French it sounds like Eros c'est la vie. Eros, it's life. Eros is life. But Rose C'est la Vie was this drag persona that Marcel Duchamp would dress up in, and then he created products in her name. And it's come to light that it's likely that he based Rose C'est la Vie, his drag persona, on Florine Stettheimer. She was such a character, kind of a seminal queer figure in the history of American art. Oh, if there weren't questions, you wanted me to go back. Can you say more about the overt eroticism in the Cadmus paintings? Yes. Yeah, someone once mentioned to me that it looks like the guy in the upper right-hand corner here is wearing assless chaps. In fact, he's wearing very pink pants with rawhide or suede patches on them. They're sailors. They're mostly like maritime workers. And so it's maritime workers taking a break, wearing the kind of work clothes that they wore that had a more industrial quality to it, with this baker woman. And it's the hat that she's wearing. It's this very traditional hat. I forgot to look up the name of it before I actually gave this talk today. And yes, the banquettes are totally a phallic symbol introduced in the image. There's baguettes all over this image. She's selling, there's these two baguettes that are jutting out behind us there. There's the baguette that the biker in the center is holding. And the baguettes are maybe phallic icons in the image. But the other thing to say about the Cadmus work and the eroticism of it is that it's not just that there's these two semi-naked men on bikes posing as this kind of erotic coupledom. But if you look at the wall that's behind them, this kind of almost like this balustrade, you can see that it has this V shape that's pointing directly to the center of the canvas. And the visual effect of that, and even of the wall that the man with the dark blue shirt is leaning against, it all draws your eye forward and it pushes your vision right towards that image of the bicycle seat jutting into that man's butt. And so that's also part of the eroticism here, is that Cadmus would compose the architectural elements of his paintings so that it was unmistakable that we were looking at erotic aspects of the body, that he was really trying to highlight them, pushing them to the extreme. And that's why many critics hated this work in the time it was made in the 40s and 50s and even the 30s. They found it narcissistic, they found it self-indulgent, they found it kitschy, they found it too queer. And it was really in the 1970s, during the era of gay liberation, that art historians and activists and art aficionados were looking at this work saying, this is amazing work that has been trying to kind of capture something about queer life in this really brazen way for so long. And it's in that period that Cadmus really came to people's attentions. Let's see, what time is it? Oh, I have about 1 minute left. I'll just quickly say I did skip over some work, and what I skipped over was Martin Wong's work, which is maybe a great way to end. Martin Wong was a Chinese American, a queer Chinese American artist who spent most of his time making paintings living on the Lower East Side. And a lot of his works draw on the culture Loisaida, of course. And many of his paintings are actually of either storefronts, individual storefronts, like bodegas and things from the Lower East Side, or brick walls on which you can find graffiti. And so he paints bricks everywhere. It's bricks upon bricks upon bricks. And this work, Mi Vida Loca, My Crazy Life from 1991, is this religious kind of painting, this kind of altar that he's created around this huge phallus created all out of bricks that dominates the image, even maybe eroticizing the arch that's so familiar to these kind of gilded frames. But if you look closely at the painting, and it's hard to do so here, but you can do so on the Whitney's website, I've given you a close-up. What you'll see is that behind this imposing phallic image is actually a scene of the skyline of New York City, and particularly the tenement structures of the Lower East Side. More bricks, but in a lighter tone. And one thing that I've thought about is, besides the fact of being a clearly queer artwork about documenting a kind of eroticism, there's also this kind of critique of the rebuilding of the city. The idea that all of the massive skyscrapers in our city are all themselves sort of phallic icons that overshadow maybe the kind of more collective communal life that happens in the background underneath these imposing images. There's an attempt in Martin Wong's work to look at the bricks that literally build the city one by one. And as I mentioned, he paints the graffiti on the bricks. So he's also thinking about how people have created their own images, marked their own place against that logic of these grids inside of the bricks, against whatever walls have been built. There have been artists trying to kind of put their mark into space. And so if you look at the close-up, you also see that what he's given us is not only New York City, but the signs of Pisces and Pegasus. And so there's these references to mapping that, although it looks very kind of Roman Catholic when you start to see this image, it actually really veers away from that. Martin Wong, of course, has a piece at the center. Here, it's bricks on bricks, which is sort of interesting, that maybe there's something he found in the center that didn't need this kind of staging of critique. He could just paint the scene of phallic bricks on the actual bricks of this space, because of course, I would imagine this is a space in which he would find a sense of community and belonging against the kind of ostracization that one encounters in the otherwise built environment of the city. But lastly, to say that this is a work in the Whitney's collection as well, called Viva tu Vida and Loisaida, which is a print that Wong made as part of this collective project done right after the Tompkins Square rebellions, I should say, which was a protest against the gentrification of the East Village. And these posters were all produced to be wheat pasted all throughout the city, so they would have gone up over the bricks that Martin Wong would have painted. In this case, what he's doing is kind of creating what looks like a faux advertisement for moving to the Lower East Side. Viva tu vida, live your life. And if you were to read it with the rhyme, it would be Viva tu vida and Loisida, but of course that's a mispronunciation. So it would trip you up tongue-wise to say it the wrong way. It would sound like an advertisement, but it would give you away as someone who actually doesn't belong to this community. And yet in the center of this image is a painting of a figure who appears regularly throughout Martin Wong's work, which is one of his lovers, a poet named Miguel Pinheiro, and of course is a scene of a kind of queer eroticism, and maybe a way of Martin Wong remarking on how the space that Loisaida had created between the Black and Puerto Rican communities that had found space there, the queer communities that had found space there, were all the things that were attracting real estate money, and attempt to think about how art might fight against that logic of gentrification, which seems like a really great way to kind of end and think about what we've been, what queer artists are struggling with today. So maybe I will end there. Oh, is there something? about the co-opting of traditional technique of sightlines and perspective relating to cruising. Yeah, just to say, sorry, I missed that works, that moment of perspective and the question about perspective and cruising. And the only thing I would say about that is that perspective traditionally, it kind of forces you to look at the world in one particular way. And when we have artists like Cadmus playing with perspective, they're showing us people who are looking at a scene, but not from the vantage point of the viewer of that scene, right? So there's a way in which they're suggesting there's something outside of the frame. There's a world beyond what we can actually see. That could certainly be read as part of the idea that we should read deeper into these works and find the queer history inside of them. All right, I think I have gone a little bit over the time allotted, and so I don't want to keep everyone. Oh, wow. Regarding the cat, I missed, there's questions in the chat. I did not include the work of Minor White. That's true. There's, the truth is there are just so many artists that we should be including in this, and there's no way we can fit that all into one session. Minor White would be a great one. I would also say the other talk that I do for the Whitney right now, going off of that painting of Stettheimer of herself, is that we should always recognize that queer women invented the selfie, particularly through the ways in which artists like Claude Cahun, Florence Henry, Lisette Modell have always been using forms of photography to stage their own image of themselves against the kinds of ways in which the female body has been captured by the male gaze. And so if you're interested in that, you can come hear me talk about in a program called Me, Myself, and I, which will be happening in a couple weeks actually on the Whitney, and it's free and available to everybody. Yes, and there was a link between homosexuality and communism in the 50s, which is probably longer than I can talk about, but I will just say there was this crazy idea among people that there was I shouldn't say it like that. There was actually a purging of gay men from the US government under the fear that they were homosexual, because the logic was that they were more susceptible to blackmail by the communists, and B, because they were potentially more seducible by the masculine forces of the fascists. And that was an actual logic from that time. It's kind of insane. But if you're interested in reading about that, there's a great essay by the scholar Lee Edelman called Tea Rooms and Sympathy. And I would be happy to provide that essay to anyone who's interested, and I can share my email in the chat with everyone, just in case you're interested in getting in touch and learning more. There you go. Great. Thank you all so much. This has really been a pleasure. I hope it's been enjoyable to look at some of this stuff. We will definitely do other stuff with the Whitney, and I'm doing actually another Queer Belonging talk next week through the Whitney, and so I'll probably vary the artists, and if you want to hear more, come tune into that.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you so much, Whitney. Also, we've been partnering with the Whitney for a couple of things through the Community Action Network. We're neighbors in the area, and so we feel like moments like this are the best times for us to congregate together and also share some of these resources. I pulled out Art and Queer Culture book also. That's a book that talks about queer art if people are interested in reading a little bit more on some of these, which you can also order through the Bureau of General Services Queer Division bookstore and support queer bookstores at that as well. But we really do appreciate your presentation, Joshua. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Daima. Thank you, Lance, for helping us put this together. And we look forward to seeing you in person very soon. So please feel free to reach out and to continue to support both Whitney programs and center programming. So
great. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Be safe.
Bye.